Welcome to the Catbird Quilt. I'm Kathy Martin, and in today's video, I answer the question, how much binding can you get from a men's dress shirt? And I have a lot to say about it, so let's get started. Some of you have messaged me on different social media forums, Instagram, Facebook. Some of you have commented asking how much binding can you get from a men's shirt? And I'm glad you asked the question because I had that same question myself. And I had heretofore not been willing to commit to cutting up all the different size shirts because I wasn't sure I wanted to commit a whole shirt in every size. But I really have been wondering, and if I wonder something, I'm going to have to figure that out. So I'm really, really excited about this video and this information. I think you're going to be so surprised at how much how many 2.5-inch strips you can get from a men's shirt. For my binding, I use 2.5-inch strips. It's just the size that I like. And that's also the same size as a jelly roll strip. That's the loose standard. So if you are interested in making a quilt that says jelly roll friendly or uses a jelly roll, you can use this same information to figure out how many or the length of strips that you can get from a men's dress shirt. From here to the end of the video, the size binding or the size strips and binding that I'm discussing is 2.5 inches. A couple of qualifications, actually 4 of them, and I have my notes here so that I be sure and cover all of the bases. This is a very specific sort of video today. Number 1, men's shirt sizes are not necessarily consistent. They're definitely not consistent between brands, and they're sometimes not consistent within a brand. And I'm sure you've had that experience where your husband or son or father wears a large and then you order a large shirt and get it and bring it home and they put it on and they feel like a sausage in it. And so you put it in the bag to take it back and you never take it back and then it goes to the thrift store. P.S. That's how you get men's shirts with tags on them at the thrift store. Maybe that's just me. But anyway, so just because I'm using a large, your large shirt may not be the same size as my large shirt. And that also includes even within, so for example, a Lands' End shirt, you might get a slim cut shirt that's a large versus just a regular cut. And I think they have something called like a sport cut or whatever. So there's going to be some variation even within a large, even within the same brand name shirt. So just know that going in, that my large may not be the same as your large. And I think that's probably also even true internationally. So shirts manufactured for Americans might be larger than larges that are manufactured for those of you in other countries. So just know that going in. Number 2, the total that I'm going to give you in length and then also in yards. We Americans use yards. Don't ask me why we did not go to the international metric system. I don't know. Doesn't make sense. So obviously, if you're not here in America, it's going to be I'm going to give yards as the total, but yours would be meters and it will be smaller. And they are approximate. So I'm going to show you how I did it so you'll be able to see for yourself, but there's a little wiggle room. I did not sew every single strip and then measure to the T. So the total amount will be approximate. And I mean, it's probably not going to be off by much, but if you're cutting it really close, just know. Number 3, if you are matching up a print or if you have a directional fabric like stripes or whatever, or if you are going to fussy cut, your binding strip so that every single piece that you cut from your shirt is exactly the same, you're not going to get as much out of your shirt. And those of us that have been quilting for a little bit, that seems kind of obvious, but it's one of those things that you don't think about until you start actually cutting your shirt. So just know you may not be able to get as much binding out of a shirt if you're going to fussy cut it. And then last but not least, always measure your shirt before you commit it to binding for a project. And for all of the reasons above, if you're going to fussy cut it, if your shirt has run small, you just want to measure. I will give you a good starting place for lengths and sizes and all that good stuff, but you want to measure your shirt, and I'll cover that at the end of the video. So we're just about ready for me to show you how I arrived at these conclusions. I do want to let you know, for those of you that just want the information, and that's totally okay, we have put timestamps at each shirt. So if you just want to know what is the number of inches or yards that you get for a small shirt, medium shirt, et cetera, that will be timestamped on the video. And you can just click on that and you don't have to get all of the extra information that I always give because I have a lot to say about it. And this is one of those topics that it is as easy or simple or as complicated as you want to make it. If you're doing solid binding, this is a straightforward. But if you're going to fussy cut a plaid, that's a whole other thing. So there's just there's going to be a lot of information in each section. But if you just want the numbers, click on the timestamp. All right. So let me show you first how I did my process so you'll know. All right. Here we go. Okay. So spread out before me in all its glory is the first shirt. This is a small. And what I did is I broke down my shirt like I do with my process. And then I laid my shirt out and just cut it into 2.5-inch strips. And I included the yoke, the yoke. That's the part that goes across the shoulders, both sleeves, front and back, both fronts and the back. And I cut them and squared them off. And now I have them on my cutting mat, which I'm using as a measurement. And I grouped them by kind of loosely matching lengths. So I've got 3 strips here that are just about 12 inches. One might be a little bit longer, but I rounded down. So I did a lot of rounding up and rounding down, hence this is an approximation. Here I have 6 strips that are 15 inches. You can see actually quite a few of them are 16, but then I have one that's below 15. And I just kept a tally. So 3 at 12 inches, 6 at 15 inches, 1 at 18 inches, it's a little bit above, 3 at 20 inches, 2 at 22, 4 at 24, and 4 at 25. And that's a little bit shy. So this is the whole shirt cut into strips. And I will confess to you, I don't typically buy small shirts just because they don't give as much fabric as I like. So sometimes it's not as cost effective, but I knew that I needed to do this for the video. So I just bought kind of a inexpensive small shirt, looked at the tag, said small, bought it, got it home, did the whole thing. And then as I was breaking down the shirt, I realized it's actually an extra small. So a real small will probably have more fabric than this. So I'm calling it a small, and what's the difference between an extra small and a small anyway? I don't know. So I did the math. And so 3 times 12 is 36. And then 6 times 15 is 90. Added it all up. Drum roll, please. 444 inches of 2.5-inch binding. What in the world? That is so much fabric. That would cover almost any quilt, honestly. And it's a small. The thing you have to remember though, and I did not stitch all these together because some of these I plan on using as 2.5-inch squares, not as strips. You do lose inches in the join. So when you sew your strips together, if you're familiar, let me use I actually did an example of this. So we have our 2 strips here and you put them at right angles to each other and sew it. And then this would be trimmed. This gets folded back. And so you lose 2.5 inches in length because of the join, because of the seam. So what I did is I counted up the total number of strips. There are 23 here. That 23rd, if you can imagine, all the strips joined together. The very last one will not have a seam. So you subtract 1. So that's 22 seams to get all this sewn together at 2.5 inches is 55 inches. So from our 444 inches, if we butted all these together and stretched it all out, minus 55, and here's the real drum roll, 389 inches of stitched together binding in total length. 389 inches. What the what? That is crazy. And if you need that in yards, for those of us that are Americans, that's 10.8 yards of binding from a small, extra small shirt. That is a lot. That is so much binding. That is almost any size quilt. Not quite, but almost. So that's our small shirt. I'm going to say it again. 389 inches in length, 10.8 yards. So I'm going to stack this up, and now we're going to do our medium. So next we have our medium shirt. And every time I did one of these, every time I cut a new round of strips, I learned a little extra something. In this case, this is a very small, at first blush, it looks like a check, but it's actually little teeny, not quite perfect circles. This is where I obviously made my example of how you lose the 2.5 inches in the join. So this strip, so if you need to see that for yourself, this strip is 12 inches. This strip is 11.5. And so when you open it up, so 11.5 and 12 is 23.5. And you can see we're at 21. I may have made a very big seam, but anyway, so that's 21.25. So that's that 2.5. And again, approximation. So you can see where I'm going with this. I'm not going to stretch this all the way out and belabor the point, but it was on this shirt that I realized, oh, wait, we're going to lose some in the join. So I did that kind of test with this shirt. And so I'll just give you the total on it. 504 inches of strips. Once you account for the seams, which there are 23 seams in this, so one more strip than the previous shirt, you lose 57.5 inches, which lands at 446.5. Guess I could have rounded that up since it's an approximation. So 447 inches of 2.5-inch binding, and that's 12.4 yards. So you can see, I mean, we knew this would be the case because a medium shirt is bigger than a small shirt, but it jumped from 10.8 yards to 12.4 yards in total length. So now I'm going to take this off my table and we're going to go to the large, and I'll learn something when I got to the large. So here is my stack of large pieces, and you may notice that there are a lot of very small pieces here. Like, what's the difference there between that medium and the large? You would think that the pieces would just get bigger and bigger. And they do, but when I was doing this process, of course, I was talking to my friend Jennifer, who was in the process of cutting a shirt for binding, and her shirt happened to be a stripe. And she got ready to do the cutting of the strips. And of course, if you're going to make your striped binding, you don't do the stripe with the lines of the quilt, you do it perpendicular. So the quilt is this way and the stripes are this way. So if you have a striped shirt, that means you have to cut the shirt crosswise. So I'm going to show you that on a shirt in case you're not tracking with me. So don't have a striped shirt to show you, but we're going to use our imagination. So imagine this is a shirt and the stripes are going this way. You would need to cut your binding this way. So I'm going to call this crosswise. This is lengthwise. This is crosswise. And you can see just exactly how that would go. You can just imagine with any of these strips, it would just go across like this. And that way, when you fold your binding and then fold it again, it's these nice little stripes all the way on the edge of your quilt. So we were talking about, I had just actually done the small and the medium. We were talking about the large. And she said, oh, I cut it crosswise, and it's phenomenal how many strips of binding you can get out of it. And I was like, that is so true. And so I cut the shirt that I had lengthwise so that we could compare and see if there was a difference. And it turns out that there is a difference. And the reason there's a difference is because when you cut binding lengthwise, places like these arm cutouts, and I'm going to use my ruler right here to show you. So I can get a strip. Now, this is a little bit unfair because this is a really, really, really big shirt. But you can see that these curved pieces, you lose a fair amount there. You can imagine that. So this strip would get cut, and then this whole section you'd lose. And that's true for all of the curved parts. And sometimes when you are cutting lengthwise, it doesn't really come out even. You can see this is as if I was doing strips all lengthwise. And you get to the edge, and sometimes you get all the way to the edge, and it's like you can't quite get that last little section. It'll be like this. And so you lose that part, and you lose the part that's curved. I've actually had it, I don't know if you can see through my ruler. So I've had it do exactly this, where you get this strip and you lose all of that, because this is where here's the curved part of the shirt. So it's not wide enough to do a whole binding strip. And then you lose this section, which is not wide enough for a binding strip. Does that make sense? Okay. Y'all, I said, does that make sense? As if you could answer. And Paul is behind the camera, and he nodded. So thank goodness I have an audience. But if you think about it now, in contrast, if I do my strips this way, so I'm just gonna do it. This place that's the curve, I do lose this, but I don't lose this section, because when I go here, that's part of that next strip. Does that make sense? So you do lose a little of that corner, but you gain that little side piece that was not wide enough to do a whole binding strip. And you get that on both sides. So it was probably 1.5 inches for, let's just see how many strips. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on both sides. So 15 more inches. So it's 1.5 times 5 strips on both sides. We just got back 15 inches worth of binding. Whereas if I had done this situation, I lose that in addition to the corner. So if you want to maximize the amount of shirt that you get, you really want to cut it crosswise. The problem with that, as if there is a problem, but there's something to consider, and I'm going to get the shirt front. So I didn't press this, but you can still see. The problem with that, and it's especially if you have a directional or a print that you want to make sure it matches up with so your front back needs to match up with your front back. Your shirt back, if you want to match it up with your shirt front, then you would need to cut the front crosswise as well. And so what that means is your pieces are much smaller. So you can see here, if we cut it lengthwise, this is a long strip. But if this happened to have a print that I was going to match, then I would need to do the front crosswise. And so, yes, you're going to get more fabric. You see me holding my ruler. So how many strips that is? It's just a ton. But you're going to have more seams. And so that's something to consider. If I were doing this XXL shirt, well, number one, I wouldn't have to use anything but a front, probably. But if I were actually using this very shirt for my binding, because it's solid and there's not really a nap on it, so it doesn't have a sheen, it's not going to reflect the light a certain way. And really and truly, once it's sewn together, it does. This is twill, so it has just the slightest little diagonal, but you would not notice in the end binding. So I could cut the back crosswise and the front lengthwise and get even more out of it. So this is the thing about it's as simple as you want it to be or as complex as you want it to be. And it really just depends on your shirt and your project. So if it's a solid, you can cut the back crosswise to get as much as you can out of it, and then use the lengthwise in the front so you get these long strips and don't have to have as many joins. But if you are matching, you're going to need to take that into account and also realize that you're going to, be making a lot of seams. And for a lot of people, that's not a big deal. I actually love making binding. I don't know why. It's really enjoyable to me. So having extra seams does not bother me. If you do a pretty decent job of sewing and pressing, you don't really see them in your end result quilt, but it can be a little bit thicker where that seam is. So if that's a concern for you and you just want longer strips, then you would need to take that into account. Okay, so that's enough about that. Not really. We'll probably revisit, but I'm going to put the shirt away. So back to the matter at hand. That's why there are so many of these short pieces, because I did exactly what Jennifer and I talked about once I realized, I can get more strips or more length out of it if I cut it crosswise. But what that means is much smaller pieces that come from that front. So I did the same thing here. You'll notice on this set that I did not square up my edges on my strips. And the reason I didn't, again, conversations with Jennifer, if you think about it, when you square them up, you lose, it's nice because you go to do your binding and it's just, lined up nicely. But if you've got these kind of angles, you can actually sew that in such a way that you kind of mine the extra fabric. So you would not lose an entire 2.5 inch strip. You would lose, just that, which is not a whole entire 2.5 inch square. So depending on how you line your strip up, so this would still lose that, but this way would not, because you're only losing this little bit on that strip and vice versa. That's not the best description, but I hope this is supposed to be like how many binding strips and it's turning into. But the point being, if you're clever with how you line up your strips to sew them together, you don't necessarily have to square them up. You can use them in such a way that you don't lose as much. And really and truly, you could even cut this on that 45-degree angle. And then actually that's a 30-degree. You could do it on the 45-degree angle, and you see that's how much I would lose, just that little triangle right there, as opposed to a whole 2.5-inch square. So I didn't, from here forward, I did not really square them up, and I just kind of approximated. So like this is obviously all the way to 19, but this section isn't. So I just kind of rounded up and down based on what I thought. And so here we are at the large shirt. I told you I would get around to the point, and here we are. The large shirt, this particular one, 545 inches before all the seams. This one would have 33 seams. And again, that's probably because of these short pieces. And so that you'd lose 82, nearly 83 inches in total length due to the seams, but you'd end up with 463 inches of binding, which is about 12.8 yards of fabric. Just phenomenal. Now, to bring it all around, to circle around, Jennifer's large shirt that she cut and she actually did sew together because she was going to use it, is going to use it in a quilt project. Hers was nearly 14 yards of fabric. So mine came out to 12.8, and it's because I didn't actually sew and, mine all those little angles. So you could eke more than 12.8 yards. She ended up with 14. So that should tell you that, squaring off your edges, being clever with how you piece your binding together, and cutting crosswise really does add more length. So if you had a shirt and you measured it and you had a doubt, will this really cover the distance? If you're wise about how you sew your binding and you cut it crosswise, you can give yourself some extra wiggle room. All right, so next up is extra large. So here we have our extra large shirt, which, true story, once you break a shirt down, you don't have the tag on it. And I was doing these in the evenings, cutting these strips, and I couldn't figure out how to keep my shirts separate without writing on the shirts. And so I actually I made like an L with pins, and then I made an M with pins. And so I thought this was my extra, extra large. It turns out it was extra large. I did it and I was like, wait a minute, that's less than the last one. Oh, so kind of silly goose moment. But I want to show you this shirt in particular, not just for how much binding it gives. And I'm actually not going to spread that all the way out. You get the point. But this is a very unusual shirt. It's like a check and a plaid. It actually was a gradient in a square. So it was light in the middle and went to dark. And you may wonder why I cut this shirt up. I have had this shirt for a little bit of time, and I kept trying to think of how I wanted to use it in a project and just couldn't seem to make it work. And so what I probably will use this for is I'll probably cut these into 2.5-inch squares. And then they'll be similar, but not exact. And I love that. But it brings up the point, this would have been a great shirt to cut fussy cut. So if I wanted to use this as binding instead of as an experiment for how much binding, clearly this would not be the way I would want to do it, because they will not match all the way around the quilt. And everywhere that there was a seam, I'm holding these together, you can see obviously from the same fabric, but would be pretty obvious that it was not cut to match, if that makes sense. So you would see everywhere there was a seam. That may or may not bother you. It would bother me. So in this instance, what could have potentially been a great way would be to fussy cut it. Now, this isn't also an excellent time to talk about measuring and using your ruler. I am not generally a huge fan of having lots and lots of rulers. I know Some of you are, and that is so great. And it works for you. And you are probably people who do not use your mat to measure. You use your ruler to measure. But for me, we do not have a large house. I don't want a lot of extra things around. I like to just use my few tools. I do use my cutting mat to do my cutting. And so if you use your mat and your ruler together, you don't have to have a lot of specialty rulers. But this is one that I really recommend. This is actually a Creative Grids. It's called Bias Binding Simplified. It is a binding ruler, and it is exactly 2.5 inches wide. And you saw that earlier when I laid out the shirt. I use that to measure how many strips I can get out of a shirt. And at the beginning of this video, I said you always want to measure. And so let's talk about that now. That's the way I measure. So if I have a quilt project planned and I'm getting to the binding fabric decision, and I think I want to use a shirt, I'll get the pieces of the shirt out and do exactly what I just did with that light brown shirt, that tan shirt, and I will measure it with my 2.5-inch binding ruler, and I'll add up the number of strips that I can get. So this happens to be a 21-inch ruler. I'm sure you can get them larger. And I just, I count how many of these, and then I do exactly what I did in this for my shirt. So 21 inches times 6 or 10 or 15 or however many I can get out. And then I'll know my total length without having to cut it. The benefit of that is that before you get started, so you don't get the whole shirt cut down into strips like this and then don't have enough. It also, you can just only cut the amount of shirt that you need for your binding. And that's important because this shirt is actually going to be the most instructive shirt, by the way, of the whole thing. So I'll give you an example. I had this purple shirt. This is not the original purple shirt, by the way. This is the second one. And I used it for binding, and I cut the whole shirt into binding strips. And I used it for the quilt, worked beautifully. And now I have these binding strips that I did not need. And they are covered in pieces. Urgh! Although secretly excited because I like picking. So I will use them for 2.5-inch squares, or I might use strips. So it's not like this is going to go to waste. But looking back, I wish I had just only cut the amount of strips that I needed for the binding of that quilt. And then I would have had, you can see the size piece that I would have had. What if I wanted to use, what is that? Probably 8-inch, maybe 7 inches square. I would have had 2 of those that I could use. So if I wanted to use a big punch block of purple, I would have had that to use. And instead, I cut it into binding. And now I'm limited by how I can use these strips. People ask me sometimes, once you get your shirt broken down, do you go in and cut it into 2.5-inch strips or square? No, I don't. You never know what kind of quilt pattern you're going to use. And if it has 6-inch blocks and you've cut your shirt into 2.5-inch binding, now you can't use it. So it gives you way more options if you go on and measure and then only cut what you need. And then you have a whole ton of shirt remaining to use in another way. The other part about this shirt and using this clear ruler is if you want a fussy cut. You didn't think I was going to remember that that's where I was, and I'm coming back to it, but I did. So I'm going to show you that. This is a strip of binding that I used for the Coupleway quilt. Recently did a quilt story about that. And what I did, every strip of binding was identical. And I wanted this particular fabric. I loved this particular plaid. And I did a little test. So that's, it gets sewn down to the front and then it gets folded over. And I think I actually folded it this way. So that was going to be the front. And then that was the back. I loved it, and I thought that was a great idea, and then I was like, "Oh, shoot, now I gotta fussy cut it," and I had never done that before, and so what I did with my handy dandy clear 2.5-inch ruler is I decided exactly where I wanted it to be, which was this strip right here, and then I figured out where that was in the pattern. You can see I'm actually lining it up right now. And so I would line it up and go, this is what I want it to be. Now my fabric is stretching. I have not ironed it. And if you want to do this, I really suggest you starch it before you get started. And then I laid my clear binding ruler down over it and I cut exactly that strip. And I did as many of those as I needed to make the length that I needed for the quilt. So you can see it's here, and then it's again here, and then it's again here. So it's just that repeating pattern. But you can also immediately see that as soon as you do that, I lose this section in between each one. So that yellow strip, same here. So it does create a lot of waste, and you're not going to get as much binding. And that's what I said in the beginning about if you decide to fussy cut to match your plaid, you're not going to get as much binding as you would just cutting it straight. So cautionary tale, also just word to the wise, that's how you can approach that. So the rest of the story is because this is an extra large shirt, it wouldn't even matter how much waste there was because the total number of inches for these strips, 674 inches. With the join, there were 39 strips. So 39 times 2.5 is 97 and a half. And so it would come out to 576 inches in length, which is 16 yards of fabric, which is, I probably don't have to tell you, more than enough for a quilt. In fact, let's just do a little test, shall we? So a good size, a king size quilt, I think it's 108. So let's just use that. Let's just say 108 squared. So 108 times 4, the total perimeter of that king size quilt is 432. And I don't know who they are, the quilt police, people who know the internet, suggest that you have 20 inches extra, and then that covers your 2.5 inches in each corner that you lose. And then when you do the join, so that's 452 total inches that you would need. So at 576, if your question is my extra large shirt enough to do binding? Yes, it is. I will say I made a very large quilt for a friend and made twill binding from a shirt. And I did cut it lengthwise, not crosswise. And I ended up using 2 shirts. I did have a lot extra though. So it was probably overkill, but that would be a great time to remember if you're doing a very large quilt and you're not going to have to fussy cut. If you have just a solid twill binding, you can do it in one shirt if it's a larger, extra large, and if you cut it crosswise. It's going to have a lot of seams in it, but you can absolutely do it. So again, I'm going to say it again, 576 inches of binding, and that's 16 yards. Phenomenal. All right, last one, and then we'll call it a day, and it's XXL. All right, so this is an extra, extra large shirt. You can just see look at how thick that is. I'm not going to spread it out, kind of beat that drum. When I did all of the math for it, 784 inches total length, there would be 40 seams. And so that takes off 100 inches, which seems like an awful lot. But when you start off with 784, you can spare 100 inches. And so that's 684 inches of binding, and that's 19 yards. Now, I said at the beginning, sizes vary. Obviously, there's going to be more fabric in a tall. So this may be an XXL tall. So just bear that in mind. If you get a tall shirt or long, sometimes they have it as listed as long, it's going to have even more. This is one of those that is a plaid. I loved this shirt, but I've had a hard time integrating it into a project. But I will tell you, I saved the yokes because I think I might use this for my navy blocks, and it needs a 5-inch square. And so if you look, and I have not said this yet in this video, you can use the yokes to get additional strips. So if I take my handy dandy ruler right here, there is a perfectly good strip of binding that is 19 inches. So my 784 inches, really, we could add 19 more in, but I saved these out because I think I might use them in my navy blocks. And if you have a very, very large shirt, like my triple XL, sometimes you can almost get 2 strips. This tan shirt has been so great. So, oh my goodness, look at that. Look at the length of that strip. And then you can get another, it's not quite long enough here or wide enough, but I would definitely be able to get another half and then another half here. I really encourage you, keep your yokes and use them because you can get more strips out of them. And, you know, it's a great way. If you're doing a smaller project, it's a great way to consider, like, oh, maybe I saved the shirt back for another project and just use the fronts or the sleeves, which you wouldn't think you would get that many strips out of a sleeve, but you can. And I'm going to show you that real quick. So you can see, here's the sleeve. Now, granted, this is a triple XL, so it is a very, very wide sleeve, but you can get a lot. You can even, if you don't cut this little, I call this the leg of the arm of the sleeve. So a lot of times I'll lop that leg off when I'm breaking down my shirt and put that in my scrap bin. But if you don't, if you keep it attached, you can see that's a whole extra strip right there, especially if you're doing it this way. Now here again, because it's such an odd shaped piece, you could go this way, which I would consider lengthwise. Won't quite get one there, but you get another one here and then one more that's a little shorter. Or you can do it this way and you'll get, you know, a lot of strips that way. And then you can do your strips here. This will end up not being very useful. You kind of have to use your geometry brain to make those decisions for yourself. And it really depends on the size shirt that you have. But basically what we've demonstrated here is that you can get almost any size quilt out of almost any size shirt, which is exciting. There were a couple of other points I want to make, and then we'll call it a day. This is a binding that I cut for a whole project. So excited. I loved this yellow and white striped Oxford. And I thought, this is going to be just amazing with my gingham quilt. And I looked at the shirt and started cutting lengthwise and ended up with a whole lot of binding that I won't be able to use because I did not cut it crosswise. So you can imagine, I could probably still use it, but as you might imagine, anywhere that it's not just very straight. So that's what the binding would look like. And I'm not good enough of a seamstress or quilter to be able to line that up and keep it straight. And of course, that would also be dependent on the quilt being almost exactly straight. And so what that would do visually is the binding will be like this all the way around the whole quilt. So take a deep breath before you cut your shirt. and think through, okay, is this, because I just was having the time of my life that day cutting this binding. And lo and behold, I cut it wrong, which I'm assuming most of us have done it sometime or another. I will end up cutting this up and using it as squares in some project, I'm sure. But it's just something to consider. So if you're going to do your binding and you have a striped shirt, you always want to cut crosswise. And remember that when you do that, if you cut the back crosswise to also cut the two front pieces crosswise, it'll be a lot of joins, but it will match. And then it will make a lovely binding for your quilt. So there it is, a long version of the answer. How much binding can you get from each size shirt? If you want to just get that answer for each size, we'll put a timestamp where I give that information. So if you want to come back and reference it again, it'll be there in a little easier format for you. I hope this video has been helpful for you. Hope it gives you some good information for making decisions on binding made from men's dress shirts. I'm Kathy Martin. This is the Catbird Quilts. Thanks so much for watching.